We need rules to fly safely, and they're called the Federal Aviation Regulations, or FARs. Steve's going to cover all the ones that apply to private pilots, from licensing requirements to accident reporting.
There are many different parts to the Federal Aviation Regulations, or FARs. Part 1 is definitions and abbreviations. We'll cover these during our presentation. Part 61 is on pilot certification. Part 71 is about airspace. And FAR Part 91 is the general operating rules. National Transportation Safety Board Part 830 covers accidents, incidents, and reporting on overdue aircraft. Let's get started with Part 61. Part 61 covers the certification of pilots and their instructors, and licensing and recent flight experience requirements, and the different limitations placed on pilots. Required certificates. While operating as pilot in command, you must have an appropriate pilot certificate and a current medical certificate. There are 3 grades of medical certificates. They are issued after taking a physical with a doctor who is also a flight examiner. You'll hear the term calendar month. This means the end of the month or good through the last day of the month. A first class is good for 6 calendar months when acting as an airline transport pilot, which is an airline captain. It's good for 12 calendar months for a commercial pilot and 24 calendar months for students and private pilots. Your student pilot certificate is your medical certificate. Your instructor endorses the back when he feels you're ready for solo and solo cross countries. A second class medical certificate is valid for 12 calendar months for commercial pilots and 24 calendar months for students and privates. Notice that an airline captain needs a first class every 6 months. The third class medical is the least demanding and is only good for students and private pilots. It's valid for 24 calendar months. So you see that a first, second, or third class is good for students and privates for 24 calendar months. If a third class medical is issued on October 21st of this year, it will expire midnight 2 years later. The exact same would apply for a first or second class being used for student or private pilots. Now, what if you lose your certificate? Well, that's simple. Just send $2 to the FAA in Oklahoma City with your request, and they'll send you a replacement. Pilot licenses are issued for life, but are only good when you have a current medical. Let's look at some of the limitations that are put on pilots. You'll need to understand the following terms: category, class, type, and high-performance airplane. Category refers to the broad classification of aircraft. The 4 types are airplanes, rotorcraft, lighter than air, and gliders. Class refers to similar characteristics of a category. Airplanes can be single-engine land, multi-engine land, single-engine sea, and multi-engine sea. Type refers to a specific make and model like Piper Warrior or Cessna 150 or Beech King Air. High-performance airplanes have more than 200 horsepower or retractable gear, flaps, and a controllable propeller. You must receive instruction in high-performance airplanes, and your instructor has to endorse your logbook before you are allowed to fly them. Also, type ratings are issued for turbojet-powered airplanes, which are jets without props. You cannot fly these without being type rated for each different make and model of jets, whether small or large. You'll also need separate ratings for multi-engine land and single-engine sea. These are class ratings. Pilot logbooks. You must log all the time used to meet requirements for a certificate or rating or to meet recency of experience requirements. There are recency of experience requirements that you need to meet once you get your pilot's license. If you don't meet them, you either can't fly or can't carry passengers. You'll need to fly with an instructor every 24 calendar months. This instructor gives you a biennial flight review, also called a BFR. This is not a pass-fail exam like the private license, but a check of your skills and to make sure you are up to date on everything. Obtaining a new license or rating takes the place of a BFR and starts you out with another 24 calendar months until your next review. All this means is that every 2 years you must fly with an instructor, and this must be signed off in your logbook. You'll also need some general experience for day and night flights if you want to carry passengers, and this must be done every 90 days. For day, you'll need to have made 3 takeoff and landings in the same category and class. This means that any single-engine airplane would meet the rule for all single engines you fly. There is one glitch. These takeoff and landings only need to be touch and goes unless you are flying a tailwheel type airplane. Then they must be to a full stop. And if you want to carry passengers at night, you'll need to have made 3 takeoff and landings at night in the past 90 days. These must be to a full stop regardless if you are flying nosewheel or tailwheel type planes. Now, night is defined as the period beginning 1 hour after sunset and ending 1 hour before sunrise. It's sort of funny that if you're current at night only, you can only carry passengers at night and not in the day. If you change your permanent mailing address, you must notify the FAA within 30 days or you can no longer exercise your pilot privileges. And last, I'd like to tell you that a private pilot is just that. You may not fly for compensation or hire, but you may fly in connection with your business as long as you are not being paid just to fly. You can also charge the operating expenses or split them with your passengers. When I was in college at the University of Denver, I needed to bill flight hours. I would take friends to Aspen for lunch and a day of hiking in the mountains. Now, I just paid $1 and they paid the rest of the rental and fuel for the airplane, and this was perfectly legal, fun, and a cheap way to bill time for my commercial license. Last thing I'd like to show you is a nifty rule that they can quiz you on. And I quote, "A private pilot may act as a pilot in command of an aircraft used in passenger-carrying aircraft sponsored by a charitable organization and for which the passengers make a donation to the organization." And it goes on and on and on. You'll cover that in the FAA questions. Well, that wraps it up for FAR Part 61. Now I'll cover the regulations that deal with airspace. You'll often hear the words controlled and uncontrolled airspace. For a pilot flying VFR or under visual flight, controlled and uncontrolled refers to visibility and cloud clearance requirements and not air traffic control. A control area refers to airspace that starts 700 feet or higher above the surface. A transition area refers to airspace that begins at 700 feet or 1,200 feet AGL or above ground level. It's shown on the charts as a magenta tinted area if it starts at 700 feet AGL and as a blue tinted area if it starts at 1,200 feet AGL. You'll find that magenta is usually found around airports. This keeps VFR pilots like yourself away from pilots making instrument approaches. The Continental Control Area is controlled airspace that starts at 14,500 feet MSL, or mean sea level, but does not include airspace within 1,500 feet above the ground, and there's no upper limit. The Positive Control Area begins at 18,000 feet MSL and goes to 60,000 feet, also called Flight Level 600. Private pilots are not allowed to fly here unless instrument rated and on an IFR flight plan. Simply put, there's absolutely no VFR flight above 18,000 feet MSL. Federal Airways, also called Victor Airways, extend out of VORs which are used for radio navigation. They are 8 nautical miles wide, 4 on each side, start at 1,200 feet AGL, and go to 18,000 feet MSL. Above 18,000 feet, they are called jet routes. When using Victor Airways, you are expected to stay on centerline except when climbing or descending. It's okay to make shallow turns to the left and right while climbing so you can look ahead for traffic. Airport advisory areas are airports that have a flight service station. The FSS provides wind, altimeter, and traffic advisories if they know who's out there. But they have no control function over arriving and departing aircraft. They are 10 statute miles around the airport with the flight service station. Airport traffic areas exist at airports with an operating control tower. And the key word here is operating. They are 5 statute miles in radius from the geographical center of the airport up to, but not including, 3,000 feet AGL. Anytime the tower is open, you need to talk to them for taxi, takeoff, arrival, or even transit through the airport traffic area. And this is called a clearance. If the tower closes at night, the airport traffic area disappears and procedures for uncontrolled airports would apply. You would want to comply with FAA traffic patterns established for each specific uncontrolled airport. Airports with control towers are shown in blue on aeronautical charts. Red airports have no towers. The boundaries are not shown because all airport traffic areas have the same dimensions. Control zones are shown on the charts as a blue dashed line surrounding airports with instrument approaches. If the visibility is less than 3 miles or there's a ceiling of less than 1,000 feet, the control zone goes into effect. This keeps VFR pilots away from pilots making instrument approaches. If you see the rotating beacon on during the daytime, this means the control zone is in effect and the weather is below basic VFR. Control zones start at the surface and go up to the base of the continental control area. The extensions that look like a keyway provide additional protection for arriving and departing aircraft. Special VFR allows you to operate in control zones when there is less than basic VFR, which is 3 miles visibility and a 1,000-foot ceiling. A special VFR clearance allows you to operate in and out of the control zone with a mile visibility as long as you remain clear of the clouds. A special VFR clearance can be gotten from flight service or ground control. At night, they are only issued to instrument-rated pilots in IFR-equipped airplanes, since it would be easy to accidentally fly into a cloud at night. Certain large airports prohibit special VFR, and they're shown on the charts with these T's. TCA, or Terminal Control Areas, are established around the largest and busiest airports. Their purpose is to keep all airplanes from operating within this airspace unless they have authorization from air traffic control to enter the TCA. As you can see, they look like upside-down wedding cakes. TCAs come in 2 varieties, called Group 1 and Group 2. Group 1 is for the busiest of airports. To enter a Group 1 or 2 TCA, you must have an ATC clearance. ATC stands for Air Traffic Control, a 2-way radio, a VOR navigation receiver, and a transponder with Mode C altitude reporting capability. This allows controllers to see your altitude without asking you for it. A private pilot's license is required to land at the primary airport in a Group 1 TCA. TCAs are shown on charts with blue lines and the notation TCA, but you can't see the 3-dimensional view on the charts. You'll need a special chart for TCAs. Airport radar service areas, or ARSAs, surround airports which aren't busy enough to require a TCA. The ARSA consists of 2 circles, both centered around the primary airport. The inner circle is 5 nautical miles and extends from the surface to 4,000 feet AGL. This means the vertical limit of an ARSA is 4,000 feet AGL. The outer circle has a radius of 10 nautical miles and extends from 1,200 feet AGL to 4,000 feet AGL. There's also an outer area which is normally 20 nautical miles. ARSAs require a student pilot license or better and 2-way radio contact while in the ARSA. Also, you need to contact ATC as soon as possible when operating out of a satellite airport in or below the ARSA. The last bit of controlled airspace we'll talk about is a terminal radar service area called TERSA. They're being replaced by ARSAs, but you need to know that the basic radar service is described as traffic advisories and limited vectoring. Stage 3 service provides sequencing and separation for participating VFR aircraft. And a departing VFR aircraft can request Stage 2 or Stage 3 advisories by making this request to ground control on initial contact. Prior to entering a TERSA, you would contact approach control on the appropriate frequency. TERSAs are shown on the sectional charts with a magenta colored outline. You might be wondering now, what is uncontrolled airspace? Well, that's whatever is left over after considering all of these controlled airspace requirements. There is also special use airspace that you must know about. A prohibited area is just that. No pilots are ever allowed over these areas. The White House is the only one I know of. Restricted areas denote the existence of unusual and often invisible hazards to aircraft, such as artillery, aerial gunnery, or guided missiles. Civil pilots may enter these only with the controlling agency's authority. They're referred to as hot or cold, and this status can usually be had from Flight Service Station. An MOA is a military operations area. You are allowed in these any time, but should exercise extreme caution when military activity is being conducted. Alert areas warn pilots of a high volume of military training activity. Just like the MOA. No clearance is required, but all pilots operating in this area are responsible for collision avoidance. Warning areas are similar to restricted areas, but there are no restrictions on flight. Most are established along coastal areas in international airspace beyond the 3-mile limit. Last is ADIZ, or an Air Defense Identification Zone, which is located along our borders. You should also know that if you're in a national wildlife refuge, regulations require that you stay 2,000 feet above ground level. Well, that wraps it up for the National Airspace System. Now let's go into Part 91, which is the bulk of the regulations we're going to learn, which is the general operating procedures for pilots. As the pilot in command, you are allowed to deviate from the rules I'm getting ready to discuss. This means that if an in-flight emergency requires immediate action, pilots may deviate from FARs to the extent required to meet the emergency. So the final authority as to the operation of an aircraft is the pilot in command. And the pilot in command is responsible for determining that an aircraft is in condition for safe flight. You'll only need to send a written report of a deviation if requested by ATC. This also means you don't have to accept any air traffic control clearance which you believe to be in violation of the FARs. FAR 91.5 is one of the most significant of the regulations, and I quote, "Each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, familiarize himself with all available information concerning that flight. This information must include, for a flight not in the vicinity of the airport, weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, alternatives available if the planned flight cannot be completed, and any known traffic delays of which ATC has advised you. And for any flight, you need to know the runway lengths at airports of intended use and the takeoff and landing distance information." This sure makes sense that this is part of the regulations. What they're telling you is anytime you fly, you better make sure you have enough room to get on and off of a runway. Seatbelts must be worn by each required flight crew member for takeoff and landing and while en route. Shoulder harnesses must be fastened just during takeoff and landing. The pilot in command must brief the passengers on the use of seatbelts and notify them to fasten seatbelts during takeoff and landing. There's two exceptions: sport parachutists seated on the floor and children who have not reached their second birthday don't need to wear seatbelts. By the way, flight crew members are expected to stay at their stations unless it's necessary in the performance of their duties to go to the head or do some work around the airplane. I know this doesn't apply for the little planes we fly. The rule concerning alcoholic drinks is 8 hours between the bottle and the throttle, and no person may act as a crew member if he or she has a 0.04% by weight or more alcohol content in their blood. but prudent pilots usually put 24 hours between the bottle and the throttle and don't drink much the night before a trip. You're not allowed to carry anyone who is obviously under the influence of alcohol or drugs unless that person is a medical patient under proper care or you consider it to be an emergency. Dropping objects from planes is permitted if precautions are made to avoid injury or damage to persons or property on the surface. Parachutes must be worn by all occupants during acrobatic maneuvers. An acrobatic maneuver involves a bank angle that exceeds 60 degrees or a nose up or down attitude that exceeds 30 degrees relative to the horizon. This rule doesn't apply to the different maneuvers you're going to do for pilot certification, such as spins. Chair-type parachutes must be repacked by a rated parachute rigger every 120 days if they're made of synthetic materials, and 60 days if they're made of natural fiber. Formation flying is legal as long as prior arrangements are made with each pilot in command. Let's look at fuel requirements now for day and night flight. During the day, you must carry enough fuel to fly to the first point of intended landing and an additional 30 minutes at normal cruising speed. At night, this required reserve is 45 minutes, but you should never get down to these minimums. Transponders are required in Group 1 and Group 2 TCAs and in the positive control area, which extends from 18,000 feet MSL. They must have Mode C altitude reporting capability too. They're also required in controlled airspace above 12,500 feet MSL, excluding airspace at or below 2,500 feet AGL. So as you can see, there are a lot of numbers you're going to have to memorize as a private pilot. The following certificates must be carried in the airplane, and I have an acronym to help you remember these, and it is AERO. A, Airworthiness Certificate. This is issued at the factory, and it's good as long as the plane is maintained according to the FARs. R is a radio station license. This is required because you are transmitting from your airplane. The second R is registration, and this just shows who the registered owner is. O is operating limitations, such as placards, markings, or an approved flight manual. And I'd like to mention that all flight manuals aren't approved. They will say FAA approved if they are approved. And W is weight imbalance data for the airplane you're flying. Next, let's talk about oxygen. Supplemental oxygen is required when operating at the following altitudes. Between 12,500 feet and 14,000 feet MSL, pilots must wear oxygen if at these altitudes for more than 30 minutes. Above 14,000 feet MSL, pilots must wear oxygen all the time. And above 15,000 feet MSL cabin pressure altitude, passengers must be provided with oxygen, but they don't have to wear it. Aviation breathing oxygen is the only type used because medical oxygen contains moisture which may freeze, and welding oxygen has impurities. And of course, no smoking when supplemental oxygen is being used. There are two items you need to know about that are a little bit out of the ordinary. One is restricted category aircraft. They cannot be flown over densely populated areas, and only crew members can go flying in these type of airplanes. If an aircraft has an experimental certificate, it cannot be flown in a congested airway. Many home-builts have experimental certificates. ELTs are emergency locator transmitters. They are small radio transmitters which send out a signal on an emergency frequency if you crash your airplane. They're generally required for all flights more than 50 nautical miles from home. They transmit on a frequency of 121.5 megahertz and 243 megahertz, which is the military equivalent. It's easy to remember this because you just take 121.5 and multiply it, and you'll come up with 243. Non-rechargeable batteries must be replaced when 50% of their useful life expires. And the batteries must be replaced or recharged when the transmitter has been in use for more than 1 cumulative hour. The expiration date of the batteries must be marked on the outside of the transmitter and entered in the maintenance records. And if you want to test your ELT, do so during the first 5 minutes of the hour. And what you would do is just turn your radio to 121.5, turn on your ELT, and listen for the signal. You'll know when you have it. Now let's review the rules that are supposed to keep us from hitting each other in flight. They're called right-of-way rules and are first broken down by category or maneuverability. First, an aircraft in distress has the right-of-way over all other aircraft. When aircraft of the same category are converging at approximately the same altitude, the aircraft to the other's right has the right-of-way. If the aircraft are of different categories, a balloon has the right-of-way over any other category of aircraft. A glider has the right-of-way over an airship, airplane, or rotorcraft. And an airship has the right-of-way over an airplane or rotorcraft. An aircraft towing or refueling another aircraft has the right-of-way over all other engine-driven aircraft. When aircraft are approaching head-on, or nearly so, each pilot shall alter course to the right. An aircraft that is being overtaken has the right-of-way, and the overtaking aircraft alters course to the right. And last, when two aircraft are approaching to land, the lower has the right-of-way, but it may not take advantage of this rule by cutting in front of another aircraft. Well, if you think those right-of-way rules are confusing, so do I. What's nice is you'll rarely run into the situations we just spoke about with airships, rotorcrafts, or gliders, and you'll just be looking at other airplanes. So don't worry about them, but you do need to memorize these for the FAA exam. We'll work them over a lot more during the questions. Next, let's look at aircraft speed limits. There are restrictions on how fast we can go. Below 10,000 feet MSL, for turbine-powered aircraft, the speed limit is 250 knots, and the same for reciprocating aircraft, 250 knots. Within a terminal control area, or TCA, for turbine, 250 knots, and for reciprocating, 250 knots. Beneath the lateral limits of a TCA, it's 200 knots for turbine-powered aircraft and 200 knots for reciprocating. Within a VFR corridor through a TCA, it's 200 knots for turbine and 200 knots for reciprocating. Within an airport traffic area, now remember, that's when there's an operating control tower. Inside a TCA, if you're in an airport traffic area in a TCA, for turbine it's 250 knots. This allows jetliners to move a little faster, and 250 knots for reciprocating aircraft. Outside a TCA, but still within an airport traffic area, the speed limit is 200 knots for turbine-powered aircraft and 156 knots for reciprocating aircraft. Next, let's look at acrobatic flight. No person may operate an aircraft in acrobatic flight over any congested area, over an open-air assembly of persons, that'd be like a football game, in a control zone or federal airway, below 1,500 feet above ground level, or when visibility is less than 3 miles. In this section, acrobatic flight means an intentional maneuver involving an abrupt change in aircraft attitude not necessary for normal flight. Now let's look at aircraft lights. Position lights must be on from sunset to sunrise. You'll notice there is red on the left, green on the right, and white on the tail, and sometimes we have a rotating beacon, which is a red flashing light. At night, you'll see these lights on another aircraft. Passing to the right, you'd see green and white lights, or possibly the flashing red beacon instead of the tail light. Passing to the left, you'd see red and white lights. If you see steady white, the other aircraft is headed away from you. And if you ever see steady red and green lights ahead and at the same altitude, the other aircraft is approaching head-on. Now let's talk a little bit about ATC clearances. They provide authorization to proceed under specific traffic conditions in controlled airspace. If you receive a clearance that will cause a deviation from a rule, refuse the clearance as stated and request that it be amended. If ATC gives you priority handling, you may be requested to make a written report within 48 hours to the chief of the ATC facility that gave you the priority. Now let's look at ATC light signals. If your radio decides to quit, tower controllers can give you one of these signals so that you could land or depart without two-way radio communications. Steady green on the ground means cleared for takeoff. In flight, it means cleared to land. Flashing green on the ground, this means cleared to taxi. In flight, it means return for landing, to be followed by a steady green at the proper time. Steady red, on the ground it means stop. In flight, you want to give way to other aircraft and continue circling. If you see flashing red on the ground, this means taxi clear of the landing area or the runway in use. And in flight, it means the airport is unsafe. Do not land. If you see flashing white on the ground, you want to return to the starting point on the airport. There is no in-flight indication for a white light. If you see alternating red and green on the ground, this is a general warning to exercise extreme caution. And the same applies in flight. If you ever see alternating red and green, exercise extreme caution. Well, that's it for ATC light signals. Now let's look at some minimum safe altitudes that must be met. Anywhere, an altitude allowing for a safe landing without undue hazard to persons or property on the surface if your power fails. Over congested areas of a city, town, or settlement, or an open-air assembly of persons, you must maintain an altitude of 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a horizontal radius of 2,000 feet. If you're flying over other than congested areas, an altitude of 500 feet AGL except over water in sparsely populated areas. In these situations, you must remain 500 feet from any person, vehicle, or structure. Now let's talk about altimeter settings. Altimeter settings are required prior to takeoff and every 100 nautical miles when you're on a cross-country flight. They are received over the radio from flight service stations or air traffic control. If you are on the ground and no altimeter setting is available, you should set your altimeter to the elevation of the departure area of the airport. When climbing above 18,000 feet MSL, all altimeters get set to 29.92 inches of mercury. But as you remember, private pilots aren't allowed above 18,000 feet MSL unless instrument rated, instrument equipped, and on an IFR flight plan. Next, let's look at VFR cruising altitudes. These separate cross-country air traffic depending on the altitude being flown. When more than 3,000 feet above the ground and below flight level 290 or 29,000 feet, the following apply. For a magnetic course from 0 degrees to 179 degrees, fly odd thousands plus 500 feet. And for a magnetic course of 180 degrees to 359 degrees, it's even thousands plus 500 feet. So for example, a trip from Chicago to Los Angeles would be flown at 8,500 feet, 10,500 feet, or 2,500 feet. Now let's look at some basic VFR weather minimums. and this has to do with controlled and uncontrolled airspace. Starting at the surface and going to 1,200 feet AGL in controlled airspace, you need 3 miles visibility. We're always talking about statute miles when we refer to visibility. And you need to remain 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontally from clouds. When operating from 1,200 feet AGL up to 10,000 feet MSL, you need 3 miles visibility. Remain 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontally from any clouds. When operating above 10,000 feet MSL, you need 5 miles visibility. And you want to stay 1,000 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 1 mile horizontally from any clouds. Now, in uncontrolled airspace, different rules apply. You only need 1 mile visibility, and you only need to remain clear of clouds. This applies from the surface to 1,200 feet AGL. Now, from 1,200 feet AGL to 10,000 feet MSL, you still need only 1 mile visibility, but you must remain 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontally from any clouds. Now, from 10,000 feet MSL and above, you need 5 miles visibility. Remain 1,000 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above the clouds, and remain 1 mile away from them horizontally. You'll just need to memorize these. They're not fun, but there's some similarities that'll make learning them easy. As you just saw, above 10,000 feet MSL, everything's the same. We need 5 miles visibility and the same distance from clouds. Now, between 1,200 feet AGL and 10,000 feet MSL, the cloud requirements are the same. Visibility only changes from 3 miles in controlled airspace to 1 mile in uncontrolled airspace. Now, the biggest differences are close to the ground between controlled and uncontrolled, because you're given a lot of leeway there when flying VFR near the ground because you won't interfere with any instrument pilots. All aircraft require certain inspections. Annual inspections are required every 12 calendar months. The airworthiness certificate, which is issued at the factory, remains valid only as long as this inspection is done. A 100-hour inspection is required on any airplane used for hire, including rental and training aircraft. An annual inspection can take the place of a 100-hour. 100-hour inspections must be done every 100 hours. You can exceed this by 10 hours only to get the plane into maintenance, but this additional time comes off the next 100 hours. For example, a 100-hour inspection was due at 3302.5 on the tachometer. The 100-hour was really done at 3309.5 hours. The next 100-hour would be done at 3402.5. As you can see, if we go over the prescribed time limit, we can't get additional time out of the 100-hour. It comes off the next 100-hour. If an annual inspection was done July 12th of this year, the next annual is due July 31st next year. You'll hear the term AD. This is an airworthiness directive. ADs are issued by the FAA to notify owners of unsafe conditions found in aircraft, and they tell what must be done to fix the problem. Compliance with ADs can be found in the maintenance records. By the way, the owner or operator is primarily responsible for maintaining an aircraft in airworthy condition. They also need to keep maintenance records showing what's been done and that the aircraft has been returned to service. Certain limited preventive maintenance can be done by unlicensed mechanics, which means you. You are allowed to service landing gear wheel bearings, refinish decorative coatings, change oil, and other things that would not affect the flying characteristics of the plane. But when preventive maintenance has been performed, the name of the person performing the work and a description of the work must be entered in the aircraft maintenance records. You'll hear the term advisory circular. This is printed material from the FAA on subjects that are non-regulatory in nature, such as FAA question books, FAA publications, and pamphlets on various subjects. Some are free, others cost, and can be obtained by ordering those desired from the government printing office. Now let's talk about National Transportation Safety Board Part 830. You'll need to know about these rules and regulations, but I hope you never need to use them. Before we look at notification and reporting, let's look at some definitions. An accident is an occurrence during which any person suffers death or injury or the aircraft receives substantial damage. Let's talk about what's not substantial. Forced landings due to engine failure, landing gear damage from a hard landing, or the aircraft has a ground fire with no intentions of flight. That is not substantial damage. So I'll leave substantial damage to your imagination. It's defined as damage or failure which adversely affects the structural strength, performance, or flight characteristics of the aircraft, and which would require repair or replacement of the affected component. An incident means an occurrence other than an accident which affects or could affect safety of operations. Immediate notification to the NTSB must be made if any of the following incidents occur: flight control system malfunction or failure, inability of any required flight crew member to perform his normal flight duties as a result of injury or illness, failure of the structural components of a turbine, in-flight fire, mid-air collisions, and an aircraft is overdue and believed to have been involved in an accident. These all require immediate notification to the NTSB. You must contact the closest NTSB office immediately if you are involved in an accident or any of the incidents we just looked at. A written report is required for all aircraft accidents and must be filed in 10 days, 7 days for an overdue aircraft. If an incident requires immediate notification, you only need to make a written report if requested to do so by the NTSB. One quirk you should know is, prior to the time the NTSB takes custody of an aircraft, mail and cargo can be removed to protect the aircraft from further damage. Now here's a memory jog to help you remember reporting accidents. Notify immediately, report within 10 days, 7 days for overdue aircraft. That's accident reporting. On incident reporting, notify immediately if it's on our list, and report only if requested to do so. Well, I hope you've learned a little bit about the Federal Aviation Regulations. This is just supposed to give you some background. I encourage you to get a set of regulations of your own and read them.
And now we'll go to the questions concerning regulations. We'll be starting on page 38 with question 462. Under what condition, if any, may civil pilots enter a restricted area?
Answer number 2, with the controlling agency's authorization.
Question 463. When operating VFR in an MOA, a pilot...
Well, all three answers look pretty good, and answer number 3 is correct. And answer number 3 looks least correct, so remember, should exercise extreme caution when military activity is being conducted.
Question 464. Who is responsible for collision avoidance in an alert area?
Number 2, all pilots without exception.
Question 465. What minimum altitude is requested for aircraft over national wildlife refuges?
Well, the answer is 2,000 feet above ground level, or 2,000 feet AGL, and you're just going to have to memorize this. Answer number 3.
Next, we'll move to question 470 on the next page. All operations within an airport radar service area, or ARSA, must...
Number 2, be in compliance with ATC clearances and instructions.
471. Under what condition may an aircraft operate from a satellite airport within an ARSA, or airport radar service area?
Answer number 3. The pilot must contact ATC as soon as practicable after takeoff.
Question 472. What are the horizontal limits of an airport traffic area?
Well, that's easy. 5 statute miles from the geographical center of the airport. Let's see if we have an answer that looks like that. Answer number 3.
Question 473. The vertical limit of an airport traffic area is from the surface up to,
well, this is the second half of our definition for an airport traffic area, up to but not including 3,000 feet AGL, or above ground level. We have an answer, number 3, that looks just like that.
Question 474. Prior to entering an airport advisory area, a pilot...
We remember that an airport advisory area is an airport served by a flight service station and not a control tower. It's effective 10 miles around the airport when there is a flight service station. Let's see if we have an answer that fits this. Answer 4, should contact the local FSS for airport and traffic advisories.
We'll move to page 40, question 485. 485, when activated, an ELT transmits on...
Well, that's easy, and you probably knew this before you even became a pilot. 121.5 is the emergency frequency. 243.0 megahertz is the frequency the military monitors. A real easy way to remember this is in radio waves or radio technology. Everything works on harmonics, or a multiple of 2. So if we take 121.5, multiply it times 2, we'll come up with 243. You should never miss this answer. Answer 3, 121.5 or 243.0.
486. Operational tests of the ELT should be made only.
Number 1, during the first 5 minutes of the hour.
487. Which procedure is recommended to ensure that the ELT has not been activated?
Well, in real life, we don't check this very often, and only if you were to have a real hard landing, and I mean a real hard landing, might you check this when you shut down. But answer number 3, you'd monitor 121.5 before engine shutdown. I remember when I was a student pilot, they used to have us do it, and I think it's a little ridiculous. In real life, if that ELT is going off, its antenna is so close to the receiving antenna for your transceiver, there's a good chance you'd hear it coming through with the squelch on or through another frequency. But the FAA wants you to know, number 3, monitor 121.5 before engine shutdown.
We'll move on to page 42, question 508. FAA advisory circulars, some free and others at cost, are available to all pilots and are obtained by...
Answer number 3, subscribing to the Federal Register. Answer number 2 is somewhat correct. It says ordering those desired from the GPO, or the Government Printing Office. And like the question book here, the Private Pilot Question Book, 8080-1, that's an advisory circular that's sold, but you can't get the free ones except by subscribing to the Federal Register.
Let's go to page 49, question 589. 589. If an aircraft is involved in an accident which resulted in substantial damage to the aircraft, the nearest NTSB, or National Transportation Safety Board, field office should be notified.
Well, I remember that's immediately. Let's see if we have an answer that looks like that. Number 1.
590. Which would necessitate an immediate notification to the nearest NTSB field office?
Number 2, an in-flight fire. The other answers might look good, but remember our list of things that requires immediate notification. Some of the reasoning behind this is they want to know, the NTSB and the FAA wants to know when aircraft have problems that keep reoccurring, and that's why they want to know about fires. It's a serious problem, and if you're required to immediately report a fire, they'll see if there's a problem developing with a certain make and model airplane that they need to put an airworthiness directive out or a service bulletin out on.
591. Which incidents would require that an immediate notification be made to the nearest NTSB field office?
Number 1, an overdue aircraft that is believed to be involved in an accident.
592. Which incident requires an immediate notification to the nearest NTSB field office?
Well, just think about our list, and if you look, you'll see answer number 3, the inability of any required crew member to perform normal flight duties due to in-flight injury or illness.
593. An aircraft is involved in an accident that results in substantial damage to the aircraft, but no injuries to the occupants. When must the pilot or operator of the aircraft notify the nearest NTSB field office of the occurrence?
Number 2, immediately.
594. The operator of an aircraft that has been involved in an accident is required to file an accident report within how many days?
Within 10 days, so answer number 4.
595. The operator of an aircraft that has been involved in an incident is required to submit a report to the nearest field office of the NTSB.
Well, only if requested to do so. Answer number 4.
596. Prior to the time the NTSB takes custody of aircraft wreckage, mail, or cargo, Those items may.
It's interesting, Jeff. In all the years we've been teaching this is the first time they've ever used this type of a question dealing with the NTSB problems. It's usually pretty black and white, and this will never happen to you in real life. I hope none of this ever happens. I hope you never have to talk to the NTSB. But answer number 2, you may be removed to protect the wreckage from further damage, and you'll only find an answer like this out by reading in between the fine lines of NTSB Part 830.
597. Which is a category of aircraft?
Well, if we remember our definition of category, rotorcraft fits that, answer number 3.
598. Which is a class of airplane?
Number 2. We remember that class is a grouping of a certain type of category. So if we're talking about aircraft, we have airplane single-engine land, multi-engine land, single-engine C, multi-engine C. We have an answer, multi-engine land, that would fit our question. Number 2.
599. Which is a rotorcraft class?
That's easy. Answer 1, a helicopter.
Next page. Question 600. Which is a class of lighter than air?
You might have to look at this one carefully since you're probably not familiar with the list they have here. We have airship, gyroplane, airplane, and ultralight. Well, an ultralight isn't as ultralight as they want them to think. They have engines. So that's an aircraft. You have an airplane. Well, that has an engine. A gyroplane is a engine-operated rotorcraft, so the only answer is number 1, airship.
Go to question 602. An airport traffic area is automatically in effect when?
Well, whenever there's a control tower in operation. Answer 1, its associated control tower is in operation.
Go to 603. The definition of nighttime is?
Let's remember that our definition of nighttime is 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. We don't want to confuse that with when we use our position lights on the aircraft, which is from sunset to sunrise. And none of these rules apply in Alaska where the sun shines all summer, so let's see if we have an answer that works. Number 3, 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise.
Next we'll go to 609 on the same page. The normal radius of the outer area of an airport radar service area, or ARSA, is?
Number 4, 20 nautical miles. Now, you need to be aware that they're putting ARSAs up all over the country and that the dimensions you've learned here are just the standard dimensions, and a lot of them going up are not nearly this big or only half the size. So this is just to answer the FAA questions, and it comes out of the FAR's answer 4.
Plus there's an inner circle, an outer circle, and an outer area, so be sure that you read the question correctly. They're talking about outer area, not outer circle here. 610. The vertical limit of an airport radar service area, ARSA, is?
Number 3, 4,000 feet above the primary airport.
611. Unless otherwise specified, federal airways extend from?
Okay, all these answers kind of jumble together, and with all the regulations you've learned, you might go, well, how am I going to know the difference between 1,200 feet above ground level, 1,200 MSL, 18,000, 14,500 continental control area? It goes on and on and on. One key for remembering federal airways, Jeff, is the width is 4 nautical miles wide on each side. So if we can take that one piece of information and put it in the answers, let's see if we have an answer that has that one piece of information, and you'll have an easy way to remember this answer. Number 3, 1,200 feet above the surface, upward to but not including 18,000 feet MSL and 8 nautical miles wide. If you take a look at the other answers, you'll see that this is the only answer that contains 8 nautical miles, and you might use that as your memory jog for remembering this problem.
Question 612. Within the contiguous United States, a control zone extends from the surface upward to the base of?
Okay, one comment about control zones, just to hit it the last time, is these are weather zones. They do not really control air traffic. That's what they're for, but they go into effect when the weather's bad. They're to keep scud runners away from airports with instrument approaches. Pilots like Jeff with the airlines don't want to be bothered by little aircraft operators, maybe like myself and yours, when there's marginal weather around the airport. Answer 2, control zones go from the surface up to the base of the continental control area, which is 14,500 feet MSL. You just have to memorize that.
Next question is 614 on the next page, Steve. Private pilots acting as pilot in command or in any other capacity as a required pilot flight crew member must have in their personal possession while aboard the aircraft?
Well, I remember you always need to have your medical and your license. Let's see if we have an answer like that. Number 2, the current and appropriate pilot and medical certificates.
Last time I flew, in fact, an FAA observer jumped on our airplane, and that's the first thing he did. He sat down and said, "Hi, I'm Joe Blow with the FAA," showed me his ID, and he said, "I'd like to see your licenses."
Did they check your logbook to make sure you met recent flight experience requirements?
No, under Part 121, which airlines are under, it's a little bit different. But that's the first thing they did was look at my pilot license and my medical.
Up in Alaska, where I got my flying experience after college, same type of thing. The FAA inspectors would show up all the time. First thing they'd want to see is our required certificates, and they'd look at the aircraft, and often they could stop right there.
Right.
Go ahead.
Okay, 616. Which document or documents must be in your personal possession when operating as pilot in command of an aircraft?
Same point. Answer number 4, an appropriate pilot certificate and a current medical certificate or statement. Now, I've never seen where the word statement came from, and when I was researching these answers, I looked all through the regulations for the word statement and didn't see it, but 4 is the right answer. Don't let the word statement throw you.
617. A third-class medical certificate is issued on August 10th of this year. To exercise the privileges of a private pilot certificate, the medical certificate will be valid until midnight on...
Okay, all we need to remember about medical certificates for students and private pilots is whether it's a first, second, or third class, it's good for 24 calendar months. We've got 4 questions coming up. You should be able to answer them before we even look at the page. Answer number 4, August 31st, 2 years later. It was issued in August. It'll be good for 2 years till the end of August, till midnight of the last day of the month.
Right. Answer number 4.
Yep.
Question 618. A third-class medical certificate is issued on May 3rd of this year. To exercise the privileges of a private pilot certificate, the medical certificate will be valid until midnight on...
Well, May 31st, 2 years later. Answer number 2.
619. For private pilot operations, a second-class medical certificate issued on July 15th of this year will expire at midnight on...
Okay, the last 2 questions asked about the third-class medical. This asks about the second. I don't care whether it's a first class. Same thing for private pilots. 2 years. So answer number 4, July 31st, 2 years later.
And 620. For private pilot operations, a first-class medical certificate issued on October 21 of this year will expire at midnight on...
Same thing, 2 years. It's good for 2 years for private, 1 year for commercial, exercising commercial privileges, and only 6 months for an airline pilot like Jeff or an airline captain operating as an airline captain. So the answer is number 3, 2 years later.
Go down to 622. Which aircraft requires that the pilot in command hold a type rating in that aircraft?
Okay, remember that you need type ratings if you fly a pure jet aircraft. You're just not allowed to jump in any jet and fly them. You need to be specifically rated for it. So answer number 1, a turbojet powered airplane. Don't get that confused with a turboprop, which I'm sure you've seen with a lot of the commuters that are running around now. That's a jet engine running a propeller. When they say turbojet, they're talking about pure jet.
623. Which is a high-performance airplane?
Well, our definition is number 2, an airplane with retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable propeller. And you remember from our discussion in engines that a controllable propeller is also a constant speed propeller.
624. Before a person holding a private or commercial pilot certificate may act as pilot in command of a high-performance airplane, that person must have...
Number 4, received flight instruction from an authorized flight instructor who then endorses that person's logbook.
Let's go to the next page. Question 625. To act as pilot in command of an airplane that has more than 200 horsepower, a person is required to do which of the following if no pilot in command time in a high-performance airplane was logged prior to November 1, 1973?
All they've done is restated the same question. We have the same answer. Number 2, receive flight instruction in an airplane that has more than 200 horsepower. We're covering every question here because very few are redundant. The few that are, we're going to cover anyways. It won't hurt you to hear them.
626. If recency of experience requirements for night flight are not met and official sunset is 1830, the latest time passengers may be carried is...
Okay, well, I remember that my definition for night is 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. Let's see if we have an answer that'll work. Aha, number 4, 1930, which would also be, come on, think about clock time. What time is 1930? 7:30?
7:30 p.m.
7:30 p.m. Okay.
627. To meet the flight experience requirements to act as pilot in command carrying passengers at night, a pilot must have made at least 3 takeoffs and 3 landings to a full stop within the preceding 90 days.
Well, the answer is number 1, and it has to be in the same category and class of aircraft to be used.
Brings a point, like I fly multi-engine airplanes exclusively or most of the time. When I want to fly a single-engine airplane, first of all, I have to go out and get my 3 landings and takeoffs in single engine before I can carry any passengers. So even though I'm perfectly, I think, experienced in a multi-engine airplane in the FAA, and I get my 3 takeoffs and landings every 90 days, I still have to go out in a single-engine airplane in order to carry passengers in the single-engine airplane.
Well, what's funny about him, when I met him 10 years ago and he started working in our program, then as an instructor for our flight engineer written exams, he didn't have a single-engine license.
Right.
He was only licensed to fly multi-engine and then centerline thrust jets, I believe.
No, it was just multi-engine, any multi-engine.
He had thousands of hours and he never had a license to fly single engine. Can you believe that? So, but the point Jeff's making too is, or the point I want to make is, with it only being for category and class, let's say you rent a Piper Warrior, a Cessna 210, you fly a Mooney now and then, and you've done all your training in a Cessna 172 or a Cessna 150. If you meet the requirement in the Cessna 150 or the 172, you're good to just jump in the 210. You don't have to continually do this in every plane. It's based on class. So it's good for all single-engine aircraft. Right. Multi-engine, you need to keep your currency up there. Right.
628. To act as pilot in command of an aircraft, one must show by logbook endorsement the satisfactory 1. Accomplishment of a flight review, or 2. Completion of a pilot proficiency check within preceding.
Well, I got a gripe with the FAA here, and I've been known to express my feelings since my lifelong vocation has been monitoring these exams and preparing students for it. Everybody should have a set of regulations, and I'm sure you do, and maybe you're going to want to stop your VCR here, hit the stop button, don't hit the pause, because it's going to take you a little while to wear it out, and we wouldn't want you to wear off the oxide on this piece of tape. Read FAR 61.57 and talks about recent flight experience, and what it says is that every pilot needs a biennial flight review every 24 months to keep your license current. It has nothing to do with anything else we've said. What it says is every 2 years you need to fly with a flight instructor or you're not flying anymore. Prior to this rule coming about in 1973, if I was 50 or 60 years old, I could have got my pilot's license after World War II in the 1940s, had never gone in a plane, 20 years later just jumped in an airplane and gone flying. Well, that doesn't make much sense. So in 1975, with a whole lot of rulemaking, including the high-performance stuff we just read about, it says 73, and then there was a 2-year grace period. But in 1975, they required all pilots to have a biennial flight review. That doesn't apply to you, does it, Jeff?
You have to have it says biennial flight review or proficiency check, and I have to have a proficiency check every 12 months. Again, it's a different part number of the FARs for airlines, but we're talking about private pilots.
Well, let me get back to my gripe. There is no correct answer here, and that's why I'm spending a little time on the question. If you read 6157, it says you need this flight review every 24 months. It doesn't say every 24 calendar months. We know that calendar month is to the end of the month. Right. When they talk about 24 months, they're talking about a month right to the day, and a biennial flight review is the only spot I've seen in the regulations that deal with you, student pilots, that doesn't deal with a calendar month. But let's look at the answers. Number 1, 6 calendar months. Number 2, 12 calendar months. Number 3, 24 calendar months. Number 4, 36 calendar months. The correct answer is 24 months. They don't have a right answer. Well, the closest correct answer would be number 2, 12 calendar months, because that would fit the criteria, but that isn't what the FAA wants. And this is an instance where the FAA, with all their test writers, there's 9 of them sitting in an office in Oklahoma City, can't even write an accurate test question for a student pilot. So I doubt that this question will ever be out in the field. We produce these courses when we get the books, which is a little earlier than you're expected to use it. It takes time for us to produce the course. So I believe there is no correct answer. You'll be in touch with our revision service, and we'll let you know what we think about it, but I'd say there's no correct answer. If you had to pick an answer, and they did ask you this one on the exam, take number 2, then I would go to the written test examiner, and I'd say, hey, there's no right answer here, and I want you to note with my test result that I say there's no correct answer here on number 1,628. This will be in the same spot as the real exam, because you're going to get the same book.
Okay, now we'll go to question number 600.
If I made my point with the FAA, huh?
I kind of would choose, I'm just saying myself, I would choose number 3, 24 calendar months. It's 24 months, but I would say 24 calendar months. At least you're telling them you know the right number.
No, and
it's
you're missing
probably moot.
You're missing the whole gist of,
I understand what you're saying.
Regulation is, for some reason, with everything being calendar months, your medical's calendar months, your annual inspection is a calendar months, everything you're ever going to deal with is calendar months, except for some reason with the biennial flight review, they made it to the month. They won't give you that extra 30 days.
Or to the day, yeah.
Or to the day, and they want it to the day, and I don't see a correct answer. When there's no correct answer, we just want to debate this one just to show you how the FAA thinks.
And by the way, if you ever do get this question and the FAA knows it's an answer or a question that has no correct answer, be sure you put down an answer, because if you leave it blank, you'll miss it. But if you put down any answer and they're aware of the problem, they will count that as a correct answer. Okay, let's go to 629.
Right. And, yeah, they would give you the correct answer. It takes time for them to get all the selection sheets out of circulation when they find a problem. And there's about a half a dozen blatantly wrong questions in this book that we've run across as we've worked it. And we're going to point those out to you. Right. Go ahead, Jeff.
629. The takeoffs and landings required to meet recency of experience requirements for carrying passengers in a tailwheel airplane.
Well, remember, the only difference between that and a nosewheel airplane is they have to be to a full stop. It must be full stop in the same class airplane.
630. The 3 takeoffs and landings to a full stop that are required to act as pilot in command at night must be done during the time period from...
Okay, once again, and if you guys miss this, I don't want to hear from you. You need to remember the definition of night is 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. We have an answer that looks just like it, number 3.
631. To act as pilot in command of an aircraft with passengers aboard, the pilot must have made at least 3 takeoffs and 3 landings in an aircraft within the preceding
90 days, answer number 2.
632. To act as pilot in command of an aircraft carrying passengers, so this sounds familiar, the pilot must have made the required takeoffs and landings for currency in an aircraft of the same
category and class, but not type. Type refers to like Cessna 150, Piper Warrior, Cessna 210. We're just going over this and over this and over this. You're going to get asked about this stuff the rest of your flying career. Every time you take a check ride, every time you get a biennial flight review, they want to know if you know what it takes to stay current and meet the regulations. And that's why we're working these questions over and over again as answer number 3.
633. When a certificated pilot changes permanent mailing address and fails to notify the FAA Airman Certification Branch of the new address, the pilot is entitled to exercise the privileges of the pilot certificate for a period of only
30 days after the date of the move. One thing I'd like to mention is new pilots, when you fill out your first application with the FAA, which will either be the written test application or the application for your student pilot certificate, which is essentially just your medical, give them an address that you know isn't going to change a lot, because just the nature of aviation and the nature of pilots is they move around. As Jeff mentioned in the introduction to the course, he for years traveled around the world, and he didn't want to change his mailing address, and he didn't want his to be in a technical violation. So give him your folks' address. If you own a home and you know you're going to be there, use that address. But give them an address where you're going to be for a long time.
If you can, right?
Okay, number 1.
634. First of all, we have 2 questions that really ask about towing gliders or having to do with gliders. We included them here, even though they have to do with gliders, because you as a private pilot may in fact be towing a glider. So, with that said, 634, no person may act as pilot in command of an aircraft towing a glider unless that person has within the preceding...
Number 1, 90 days made 3 actual glider tows.
635, a certificated private pilot may not act as pilot in command of an aircraft towing a glider unless there is entered in the pilot's logbook a minimum of...
Answer number 4, 10 flights as pilot in command of a glider.
Back to aircraft now, 636. In regard to general privileges and limitations, a private pilot may...
Well, we'll remember our list. Number 3, may share the operating expenses of a flight with a passenger.
We'll move to the next page, question 637. According to regulations pertaining to general privileges and limitations, a private pilot may...
Number 3, share the operating expenses of a flight with the passengers.
Okay, let's go to 639 then. If an in-flight emergency requires immediate action, a pilot in command may...
Number 3, deviate from FARs to the extent required to meet that emergency.
We'll skip down to 641. The final authority as to the operation of an aircraft is the...
It's the pilot in command. And Jeff, you could probably talk about that better than me because you have so much more experience. I mean, there's so many things that can go wrong, and there's so many people that can throw you a curveball that the total responsibility of the flight is in your shoulders.
Well, it's like President Truman used to have a little sign that says the buck stops here. On any aircraft, the buck stops at the pilot in command. He cannot pass off responsibility for anything. I have a friend who was in an aircraft accident caused by it was frozen aileron in a winter storm, and his airplane was de-iced, and the craft, in fact, went in because one of the ailerons was frozen. Well, he was blamed. It wasn't the guy who de-iced the airplane, who you couldn't see the top of the wings, in fact, on this type aircraft. So I'm just saying that the pilot in command is always responsible, and that's why you see in so many accident investigations, one of the final findings, if not the final finding, is pilot error, because a pilot in command is responsible. So that just says that every time you go out and fly, you're hanging your license and your life out there. So just be careful and know what you're doing.
That's why we have all these rules, to try to make it more safe and give a standardization to our business.
Let's go to 642. When must a pilot who deviates from a rule during an emergency send a written report of that deviation to the administrator?
Well, upon request, number 4.
643. Which pre-flight action is required for every flight? There's an absolute, right?
Yeah, watch out for absolutes. Usually, always. They're all good answers. The next couple questions where we're talking about, or the next 3 about pre-flight planning, all the answers are good. So we have to remember our definition, that you need to determine the runway lengths at airports of intended use, answer number 2. Let's just take a look at the other answers. Check weather reports and forecasts. Hey, that's a good idea anytime you fly. Answer 3, determine alternatives if the flight cannot be completed as planned. Well, of course you always want to have an alternative course of action. And check for known traffic delays. Well, we never do that. You'll only find out about that once you're in the air and working in the ATC or radar system. But number 2 really has always made a lot of sense to me, being in Colorado, where density altitude is a real consideration. I mean, what they're telling you, the FAA with number 2, is to determine the runway lengths at airports of intended use. They're telling you that the one thing you need to know before you take off is that the airplane can get off and has enough room to land without running off the end of the runway. And that's pretty darn important, because the only goal in flying is to land them at an airport. I mean, you can think of anything else, and the only thing you want to do when you fly a plane is land it at an airport. You ever looked at it that way, Jeff?
Yeah, sure.
In boating, and I've got a captain's license and as a seaman as well as a pilot, we want to keep the people in, the water out, and get where we're going without hitting the bottom. It's easier said in aviation. You just want to land at airports. As long as you do that, you're always going to be in good shape.
644. Pre-flight action, as required by regulations for all flights away from the vicinity of an airport, shall include a study of the weather, taking into consideration fuel requirements, and
number 4, an alternate course of action if the flight cannot be completed as planned.
645. In addition to other pre-flight actions for a VFR flight away from the vicinity of a departure airport, regulations require the pilot in command to
number 4, determine runway lengths of airports of intended use and the aircraft's takeoff and landing distance data. I just want to comment on the rest of them because they all seem to make sense. File a flight plan. Filing flight plans is a good idea for cross-country flight, but it's not required by regulation. Check each fuel tank visually to ensure that it's full. Everybody in small aircraft does that every time they fly, but it's not a regulation. And number 3, check the accuracy of the Omni navigation equipment and the emergency locator transmitter. Well, that doesn't even make sense. So answer number 4 is our best answer.
646. Prior to each flight, the pilot in command must
number 2, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight.
Kind of goes back to the pilot in command being the
buck stops here,
right.
and they leave it so general that you just need to be familiar with everything. And anything or everything can be a lot of variables.
And I think as a private pilot or a new private pilot, you really need to know what everything is. You know, you can spend 3 days planning a flight.
That's what most student pilots do.
Well, if you're not really efficient, flight service station, all the different steps that you have, you really need to be guided in the direction of what needs to be done before every flight. And your instructor will certainly take that as his responsibility, and also part of this course is learning that.
Jeff, as an airline pilot, do you do all the planning in every flight, or do you have dispatchers that look at loading and weather, and the flight engineer is responsible for one thing? Where does the buck stop for an airline pilot? I know right now you're flying co-pilot on a 737, and what do you have to check?
Well, again, the pilot in command is responsible, so it's not my responsibility, it's the captain's responsibility. But the co-pilot or second in command, or in the airlines they're called first officers, they're second in command. They help out the captain, and so very often I'm always checking the weather. That's the one thing I always do. I always check the NOTAMs to make sure that there isn't something wrong at our destination airport, at our departure airport, or something in between. And anything else, again, the pilot in command is responsible. So even though you do have dispatchers in Part 121, the command authority or the ability to release the airplane for flight is shared between the pilot in command and the dispatcher. Even though there are dispatchers under Part 121 of the regulations, the pilot in command is still the bottom guy for responsibility. So he's responsible if something was missed in the pre-flight planning. So we just always check everything and check, again, everything. But
you don't trust what the dispatcher says.
You trust them. I mean, it's a cooperative arrangement, but also you know that it's your license on the line. He's at a desk, and nobody has ever had a crash in a desk and died. So you're the guy who's going to pay for it, right? So you always check the weather. You always check the NOTAMs.
Just what FAR 91.5 has always said.
Right. You check the weight and balance. Make sure.
Same thing applies.
Right.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, down to 648.
647.
Do we skip 647?
Yeah, we don't want to skip one out of 171 questions.
Okay, 647. While at their stations, each required flight crew member aboard an aircraft shall keep seatbelts fastened during.
Okay, the key here is required flight crew member. You need to keep your seatbelts on all the time. Answer 1, takeoff and landing, and while en route.
648. While at their stations, each required flight crew member aboard an aircraft shall keep shoulder harnesses fastened during.
Just takeoff and landing, answer number 2.
649 on the next page. A person may not act as a crew member of a civil aircraft if alcoholic beverages have been consumed by that person within the preceding.
It's 8 hours between the bottle and the throttle. That might not be good judgment, but that's federal regulations, so it's answer number 1.
650. Under what condition, if any, may a pilot allow a person who is obviously under the influence of intoxicating liquors or drugs to be carried aboard an aircraft?
Well, number 2, only if the person is a medical patient under proper care or in an emergency.
651. No person may act as a crew member of a civil aircraft while having.
Number 1 sure would seem like the right thing to me, any detectable alcohol in the blood, but that's pretty hard to qualify. So the answer is number 3, 0.04% by weight or more alcohol in the blood.
Do you remember what it is for airplanes? It's for cars, it's 0.1, isn't it?
In this
it depends
state,
on the
it's
state.
0.15, but they're reducing it to 0.10 soon.
Okay.
They're cutting it down by a third. So this comes far below. I don't know whether one beer meets it or not. You know what I know, and I don't know what you airline pilots do, Jeff, because I haven't been in that a while, is I just take it easy the night before I go flying.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure.
I mean, I don't get drunk knowing that I'm going to stop drinking at 9 and then make a flight at 6 in the morning. I just go to sleep.
Well, the 8-hour rule isn't even, I mean, it's exceeded. In other words, that you stop drinking if you do have a beer or two long before the 8 hours, and it depends from company to company, but most have a 12-hour rule, or some even have a 24-hour rule. Yeah. 652,
okay.
Objects may be dropped from an aircraft.
Number 2, if precautions are taken to avoid injury or damage to persons or property on the surface.
653, other than sport parachutists seated on the floor, passengers must have seatbelts properly secured about them.
Well, we remember talking about that the passengers need to have seatbelts on for takeoff and landings, but I don't think there's an answer like that. Number 1, except during takeoff and landings, that doesn't answer it. During taxi, that doesn't answer it. Unless they have not reached their second birthday, well, we haven't talked about that. And from engine start to engine shutdown, well, that's not true either. The other rule that you need to know about seat belts is if they're 2 years or under, they don't need them. They can sit on their parent's lap. They can also, of course, then get a free ride on the airlines.
You need to know, though, that the parent must have the infant on their lap. They cannot be next to them without a seatbelt in an empty seat. They have to be carried on the parent's lap. And if you do carry an adult and a child, you want to make sure that that child is not restrained with the adult in the seatbelt, because it could crush the child if you did have a panic stop situation.
That's a good point. Okay.
Okay, 655. Regulations require that seatbelts in an airplane be properly secured about.
Number 1, I'm answering it before you finish. Number 1, occupants during takeoff and landings. You should be answering them. Yeah, I'm excited. We only got about 300 more questions to do on regulations.
Okay, 656. Seatbelts are required to be properly secured about which persons in an aircraft and when?
Number 2, occupants during takeoff and landings.
657. What obligation does a pilot in command have concerning the use of seatbelts?
Number 2, the pilot in command must brief the passengers on the use of seatbelts and notify them to fasten the seatbelts during takeoff and landing.
Notice you're just supposed to brief the passengers and notify them about the requirement. If a passenger absolutely refuses to wear his seatbelt, then your responsibility is ended in that case. If you don't brief him and don't let him or her know that he has to wear a seatbelt, then you're responsible. But if you do all the required items and he refuses to wear the seatbelt, then again, that's all right. We're picking nits here, but sometimes the FAA
that's what
likes to do
regulations
it.
is all about. This is the one area where we really do that.
658. When must each occupant of an aircraft wear an approved parachute?
Number 4, when an intentional bank that exceeds 60 degrees is to be made. The other answer is all good, but the right answer is number 4.
And that's acrobatics, anytime you have an
That's the
intentional
definition for acrobatic. Is, it's nose up over 30 degrees to the horizon or an intentional bank of more than 60 degrees.
659. A chair-type parachute must have been packed by a certificated and appropriately rated parachute rigger within the preceding.
We don't think you're going to get asked this question, but we don't know because the FAA doesn't tell us how these questions break down for the different licenses. Answers for 120 days.
Question 666, next page. What is the fuel requirement for flight under VFR at night?
Okay, we're gonna taxi our minds, and we're gonna go 45 minutes night, 30 minutes day, and see if we have an answer that agrees. 4, enough to fly to the first airport of intended landing and to fly after that for 45 minutes at normal cruise speed.
667. What is the fuel requirement for flight under VFR during daylight hours in an airplane?
It's the other half of our rule. It's 30 minutes. You need to get to where you want to go and have enough fuel for another 30 minutes. Hey, I just want to mention that this is only by regulation. I have never flown with that small amount of fuel in my life, and I know Jeff's regulations require him to have a lot more fuel than this for an airline operation, and they got a much better chance of getting somewhere where they want to go than us little guys do. Number 3, enough to fly to the first point of intended landing and to fly after that for 30 minutes at normal cruise speed.
We'll skip one down to 669. An operable transponder is required in which airspaces?
Well, we remember it's Group 1 and Group 2 TCAs, and anytime we're above 18,000 feet in the positive control area. There's a few other rules. Let's see if we have an answer that follows. We do. Number 4, Group 1, Group 2 TCAs, and the positive control area, or the PCA.
670. In addition to a valid airworthiness certificate, what documents or records must be aboard an aircraft during flight?
Number 3, the operating limitations and registration certificate.
671. Who is responsible for determining if an aircraft is in condition for safe flight? Kind of sounds like who's responsible.
But buck stops here.
Yeah.
Pilot in command.
Right.
Number 3.
Now, that is not to say that the pilot in command is responsible for performing the maintenance or having it performed necessarily. It's the owner or the operator of the airplane, but the pilot in command is responsible for making sure that it's been done. So, again, you can't use it as an excuse. It's not at my airplane. I just checked it out from this FBO.
You hit it right, and especially when we hear, unfortunately, about airline accidents on television, unless there's a plane being shot down or something. It's and every couple of years that seems to happen now. But the buck always stops at the pilot.
Yeah.
Period. Where else is it going to stop?
Right.
That's what all these rules are about. Okay.
672. An aircraft's operating limitations may be found.
Number 2, in the airplane flight manual, approved manual material, markings, placards, and any combination thereof.
Next page, question 673. Unless each occupant is provided with supplemental oxygen, no person may operate a civil aircraft of U.S. registry above a maximum cabin pressure altitude of
15,000 feet MSL, answer 1. You'll need to think of our oxygen chart that we covered, and if you kind of let that burn in there a little bit, you shouldn't have any problem with any of these questions.
674. Federal aviation regulations require that when operating an aircraft at cabin pressure altitudes above 12,500 feet MSL, up to and including 14,000 feet MSL, supplemental oxygen shall be used during.
Okay, the key here is in the question, operating an aircraft. When they use a phrase like that, that means pilot in command. The words operating an aircraft and pilot in command are the same thing, so don't let that fool you. Well, for pilots, if you're between 12,500 MSL and 14,000 feet MSL for more than 30 minutes, you got to use oxygen. We have an answer like that, which is number 4.
675. Which is normally prohibited when operating a restricted category civil aircraft?
Well, number 2, flight over a densely populated area.
676. No person may operate an aircraft that has an experimental certificate.
Number 2, in a congested airway.
All right.
This is just, we'd explain something if we thought there was something to be explained. We would teach you something if we thought there was something for you to know. This is just rote memory. Just learn it.
677. When are non-rechargeable batteries on an ELT or emergency locator transmitter required to be replaced?
Number 2, when 50% of their useful life expires, and that's given to us by the manufacturer. We don't test that.
Yeah. 678. Batteries in an ELT must be replaced or recharged if rechargeable.
Number 2, when the transmitter has been in use for more than 1 cumulative hour.
679. ELT transmitters may be tested.
during the first 5 minutes after an hour. Don't you think the FAA could have put all these questions about ELTs in one spot?
A couple of them were 400 questions ago, right?
Okay.
680. No person may operate an aircraft in formation flight.
Number 4, except by prior arrangement with the pilot in command of each aircraft. The other answers might sound good. When carrying passengers, well, you might consider it's dangerous, but that's not the rule. Over a densely populated area, that would be good judgment not to do it. In a control zone under special VFR, well, you wouldn't want to do that either, but really you're allowed to fly formation. We do it all the time, and the nice in-flight photography you see in our courses, we're real close, but we plan it all before we go. We got two-way radios, we have a guy on the ground, the cameramen are trained. So the whole point the FAA wants you to know is you've got a lot of privileges as a private pilot. I mean, you're allowed to go anywhere in the world in a single-engine airplane carrying passengers. You're allowed to do just about anything you want safely, and what the point is here is to fly in formation safely. It means everybody has to keep it coordinated.
Right. 681, an airplane and an airship are converging. If the airship is left of the airplane's position, which aircraft has the right-of-way?
Number 2, the airship has the right-of-way.
Is it because he's left? I mean, he's to the
No,
left?
it's because of...
Because he's an airship.
An airship. An airship has a right-of-way over an airplane because he's less maneuverable.
Right.
Okay.
When 2 or more aircraft are approaching an airport for the purpose of landing, the right-of-way belongs to the aircraft.
Okay, let's just think about what we wouldn't want to do. You wouldn't be allowed to cut underneath the guy who's on base leg or final and do something real tricky and end up and go, aha, and looking behind you and go, there you are, and I'm lower, and I got the right-of-way. So the answer is number 4, at the lower altitude, but shall not take advantage of this rule to cut in front or to overtake another airplane.
683. What action is required when 2 aircraft of the same category converge at the same altitude but not head-on?
Okay, the aircraft on the left shall give way. I've always liked to think of this about right-of-way rules. You know, some of these things we're not going to be able to teach you so you remember forever, and you're going to have to put it together up here on your own to see how it makes sense. Well, the reason why the guy on the left has to give way is he's got the best visibility. This is the way I've always pictured it myself. As I'm sitting on the left, I can see better than a guy sitting here looking out over there. So the guy who's got the best vision and the best capabilities of seeing has got to give right away to the guy who might not see as well. Do you see it that way?
Exactly. I think that, you know, the guy on the right, he's in the left-hand part of the airplane. He can see, and he has right-of-way to make sure that he, in fact, clears the other airplane. Also, right-of-way doesn't mean if you have the right-of-way, you demand it. It's just that legally you have the right-of-way. If he doesn't see you for some reason, don't, you know, plow into him and say all the way to the ground, well, I had the right-of-way. That's obviously, you know, rather stupid. But right-of-way just says that legally you have the right-of-way, but if he doesn't see you or doesn't yield that right-of-way, then go ahead and yield to him. Okay, what do we, 685?
84.
684. Which aircraft has the right-of-way over the other aircraft listed?
Number 2, aircraft towing other aircraft.
685. Which aircraft has the right-of-way over the other aircraft listed?
Number 3, aircraft refueling other aircraft.
Next page. 686. What action should be taken if during a night flight a pilot observes a steady green light and a flashing red light on another aircraft at the same altitude?
Number 4, give way to the left. The other aircraft is passing to the right.
So let's think about that a little bit. The flashing red light, what is that? That's not a position light. That's his beacon that you're seeing. So the flashing, you're always going to see a flashing red light, or you should if it's operating. So that really doesn't tell you anywhere about which way he's going or which way he is from you. But the steady green light now tells you something. It tells you that you're looking.
Red's on the left, green's on the right. Red's never on the right. That would be wrong. That's how I remember that. So
there's more than one way of remembering that, and there's all kinds of different gouges that I've heard.
And I have to do that sometimes almost every time I look at one. I go, if red was on the right, that'd be wrong. You just don't get the red and the right. It isn't that easy to remember. Red's on the left, green's on the right. Yeah. So, okay.
Okay. So green's on the right. If you're seeing the right wing, then that's saying that his nose is passing from left to right. You're on the right. Okay. 687. What action should be taken if a glider and an airplane approach each other at the same altitude and on a head-on collision course?
Number 1, the airplane should give way because the glider has the right-of-way. But, hey, everybody does whatever they can to avoid a collision, but this is technically correct. Right. I mean, a glider has quite a bit of control. A glider has more control than an airplane in a lot of situations.
If he's got some speed.
Yeah, and altitude.
Right. 688. Which aircraft has the right-of-way over all other air traffic?
It's an aircraft in distress, regardless of why he's in distress, whether he's got structural failure, somebody's sick aboard, or he's out of fuel. He's going to get priority handling or he's in charge.
Right. 689. When flying beneath the lateral limits of a terminal control area, or TCA, the maximum speed authorized is
200 knots, number 2.
690. Unless otherwise authorized or required by air traffic control, what is the maximum indicated airspeed at which persons may operate an aircraft below 10,000 feet MSL?
Okay, we don't want to mix that up with the terminal control area. We have speed limits in airplanes, just like cars. And below 10,000 feet MSL, that's something that you're going to read on your altimeter, the speeds are 250 knots. Jeff, do you have to slow to 250 every time you go through 10,000?
Certainly do. Everybody has to, unless they have a waiver by the administrator of the FAA, and that would only be because airplanes that are very high performance, such as fighters in the military, might be able to operate at 280 knots below 10,000, for instance. But everybody operates 250 below 10 within the United States. Yeah. 691. Unless otherwise authorized or required by air traffic control, the maximum indicated airspeed at which a reciprocating engine-equipped aircraft should be flown within an airport traffic area is?
Number 1, 156 knots.
56 knots. 693. In which controlled airspace is acrobatic flight prohibited?
Answer 2, control zones and federal airways.
694. No person may operate an aircraft in acrobatic flight.
Number 2, over an open-air assembly of persons. That might sound a little old-fashioned, but what they're talking about is football fields, over the beach. Well, I don't know if they're referring to over the beach. They just don't want you flying your plane over a lot of people.
Sure, you could have a big concert like Woodstock or something. That's dating me, right? But a big concert out there with thousands of people, and they don't want you...
Where?
They don't want you doing rolls or loops or whatever just to show off. Obviously, it would be a dangerous situation if you lose an engine at the time. If you ever do see an air show, by the way, you'll notice that they always maneuver over a part of the airfield that is non-populated. It's always, they keep everybody on one side of the runway and then the airplanes are over the other side of the runway. That's the reason. 695. No person may operate an aircraft in acrobatic flight when the flight visibility is less than
3 miles, answer number 1.
696. What is the lowest altitude permitted for acrobatic flight?
Number 2, 1,500 feet AGL.
697. When an aircraft is being operated at night, except in Alaska, it must display lighted position lights during the period from...
Okay, I've made this point like 3 or 4 times. Position lights, sunset to sunrise, except Alaska. Do we have an answer that looks like that? We sure do. Number 4.
698. Except in Alaska, during what time period should lighted position lights be displayed on an aircraft?
Yeah, that's easy. Still answer number 4. Okay.
Let's go to question 700. When may air traffic control request a detailed report of an emergency even though a rule has not been violated?
Number 1, when priority has been given.
701. What action, if any, is appropriate if the pilot deviates from an air traffic control instruction during an emergency and is given priority?
Number 2, if requested, file a detailed report within 48 hours to the chief of the air traffic control facility.
702. An air traffic control clearance provides...
Number 4, authorization to proceed under specific traffic conditions in controlled airspace.
And 703, an alternating red and green light signal directed from the control tower to your aircraft in flight is a signal to...
Exercise extreme caution, answer number 2.
704, while on the final approach for landing, an alternating green and red light followed by a flashing red light is received from the control tower. Under these circumstances, the pilot should...
Number 3, abandon the approach, realizing the airport is unsafe for landing.
705, a steady green air traffic control light signal directed to an aircraft in flight is a signal that the pilot...
Number 1 is cleared to land. Hey, one thing I'd like to mention that an association I made 20 years ago, that dates me a little, when I learned to fly, except you got to be 17 to get a private pilot's license, is basically in this business, anything that's green is go or okay, and anything that's red is not. I don't care if you're looking at your engine instruments, your tachometer, anything in the airplane, anything on the ground. If it's green, go. If it's red, don't go.
Right. 706, a flashing white light. Well, there's something that wasn't covered. But a flashing white light signal from the control tower to an aircraft taxiing is an indication.
Number 3, to return to the starting point on the airport.
Right. 707. If the control tower uses a light signal to direct a pilot to give way to other aircraft and continue circling, the light will be...
Number 2, steady red.
708. Which light signal from a control tower clears a pilot to taxi?
Number 1, flashing green.
709. Except when necessary for takeoff or landing, an aircraft may not be operated closer than what distance from any person, vehicle, or structure?
Number 2, 500 feet.
710. Except when necessary for takeoff or landing, what is the minimum safe altitude for a pilot to operate an aircraft anywhere?
Number 1, an altitude allowing, if a power unit fails, an emergency landing without undue hazard to persons or property on the surface. What they're just saying there is it's your responsibility not to fly 200 feet over a forest.
Sure.
Or 200 feet over a body of water. It's your responsibility to be able to put the plane down if something goes wrong, and you know Murphy's Law.
711. Except when necessary for takeoff or landing, what is the minimum safe altitude required for a pilot to operate an aircraft over congested areas?
Number 4, an altitude of 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within a horizontal radius of 2,000 feet.
712. Except when necessary for takeoff or landing, what is the minimum safe altitude for a pilot to operate an aircraft over other than a congested area?
Number 2, an altitude of 500 feet above ground level, except over open water or a sparsely populated area which requires 500 feet from any person, vessel, vehicle, or structure.
713. If an altimeter setting is not available before flight, to which altitude or setting should the pilot adjust the altimeter?
You wouldn't have many choices. All you could do is set it to the departure airport. Let's see if we have an answer like that. Aha, 3, the elevation of the departure area.
714. When is it first required that the altimeter be set to 2992 inches of mercury when climbing or cruising altitude or when climbing to cruising altitude or flight level?
Tongue twister. You know, this question really belongs on an instrument exam because
That's right.
you change it to a 2992 at 18,000 feet MSL, and as you remember, you're not allowed to fly in the positive control area, which starts at 18,000 feet MSL. That's restricted solely for IFR traffic, which of course are under the supervision of air traffic control the whole time they're moving. So number 3 is the answer.
715. Prior to takeoff, the altimeter should be set to?
Number 1, the current local altimeter setting, if available, or the departure airport elevation.
716. What is the purpose of an airport traffic area?
Number 1, to provide for the control of aircraft landing and taking off from an airport within an operating control tower.
Yeah, and the key word there is operating. Towers shut down for night in some places, so an airport traffic area would disappear if the tower is not operating.
Exactly.
717. Unless otherwise authorized, two-way radio communications with air traffic control are required for landings or takeoffs.
Number 2, at all tower-controlled airports, regardless of the weather conditions.
718. When is an airport traffic area in effect?
Number 2, when the associated control tower is in operation.
720, we'll skip one. Which is the correct traffic pattern departure procedure to use at a non-controlled airport?
Answer number 3, comply with any FAA traffic pattern established for the airport. I like answer number 1 as a pilot. Now, I'm not trying to make trouble here, but number 1, depart any direction consistent with safety after crossing the airport boundary. Basically, when you're at an uncontrolled airport doing what you want, once you're at a safe altitude, generally you turn and go the way you want. But the proper thing is to follow the FAA traffic pattern, which is generally to make left-hand turns unless you see something that indicates it's non-standard.
721. When operating to an airport with an operating control tower, each pilot of an airplane approaching to land on a runway served by a visual approach slope indicator, or VASI, shall
maintain an altitude at or above the glide slope, which is answer number 3.
Next page, question 722. Regardless of weather conditions, air traffic control authorization is required prior to operating an aircraft within a?
Well, a TCA, and the answer is number 3.
725, in which type of airspace are VFR flights prohibited?
Well, we just talked about that, the positive control area, which is answer number 4.
726, the minimum flight visibility required for VFR flights above 10,000 feet MSL and more than 1,200 feet AGL in controlled airspace is?
5 statute miles. We're going to hit the next 10 questions, or 15, deal with these cloud and visibility requirements. I wish there was an easy way to learn it, or there was an easy way for us to explain it. You'll need to either replay the footage in the program, or we have a very nice chart in your book. You're just going to have to memorize it and make the associations that are comfortable with you in controlled and uncontrolled airspace. So we're not going to explain these, we're just going to read them. The answer is 3, 5 statute miles.
727, during operations outside controlled airspace at altitudes of more than 1,200 feet AGL but less than 10,000 feet MSL, The minimum flight visibility for VFR flight is
Number 1 statute mile.
728. VFR flight above 1200 AGL and below 10,000 MSL requires a minimum visibility and vertical cloud clearance of
Number 1, 3 statute miles and 500 feet below or 1,000 feet above the clouds in controlled airspace.
729. For VFR flight operations above 10,000 MSL and more than 1,200 foot AGL outside of controlled airspace, the minimum horizontal distance from clouds required is
1 mile. Answer number 3.
730. No person may take off or land an aircraft at any airport in a control zone under basic VFR unless the...
Number 1, I'm getting a little anxious. Number 1, flight visibility at the airport is at least 1 statute mile.
731. The basic VFR weather minimums for operating an aircraft beneath the ceiling within a control zone are...
Oh, okay, 731 is number 2, 1,000 foot ceiling and 3 statute miles visibility.
732. The minimum distance from clouds required for VFR operations on an airway below 10,000 feet is...
Number 2, 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontally.
733. What minimum flight visibility is required for VFR flight operations on an airway below 10,000 feet?
Number 2, you need 3 statute miles visibility. I just thought of at least one thing you can help to remember these. It gets tougher as you go up. You need to be further away from clouds and have more visibility because there's faster flying airplanes like Jeff.
Well, a lot faster than me too. I'm
You're just poking along 450 knots. Yeah, okay.
Not below 10,000. Above 10,000,
Okay.
yeah. 734. What minimum visibility and clearance from clouds are required for VFR operations in uncontrolled airspace at 700 feet AGL or below during daylight hours?
Number 1, 1 mile visibility and clear of clouds. I'd like to just bring up the point with this 10,000 feet MSL. It's technically okay to be at 10,100 feet going just as fast as you darn please.
Right.
So they can really be cooking just above 10,000.
735. During operations within controlled airspace at altitudes of more than 1,200 foot AGL but less than 10,000 feet MSL, the minimum distance above clouds requirement for VFR flight is...
Number 2, 1,000 feet.
736. During operations at altitudes of more than 1,200 foot AGL and at or above 10,000 feet MSL, the minimum distance above cloud requirement for VFR flight is...
Same thing, 1,000 feet. Answer number 2.
737. Outside controlled airspace, the minimum flight visibility requirement for VFR flight above 1,200 feet AGL and below 10,000 MSL during daylight hours is...
Hey, don't let this daylight and nighttime throw you, because daylight and nighttime have nothing to do with cloud visibility, or cloud requirements or visibility requirements. So the answer is number 1, 1 statute mile.
The only real world situation is the fact that at nighttime you're not going to be able to tell how far you are away from an airport or from clouds or the visibility. So
the only way you're going to know when you're in a cloud at night is when you see halo around the lights, your position lights on your wing. If you ever do see halos, you know you are in the clouds. And the best procedure then, even though this isn't in the test, is to make a 180-degree turn and get out of those clouds.
During operations outside controlled airspace at altitudes of more than 1,200 feet AGL but less than 10,000 feet MSL, the minimum distance below clouds requirement for VFR flight is
500 feet. Answer number 1.
739. We're going to beat this horse to death. During operations within controlled airspace at altitudes of less than 1,200 feet AGL, the minimum horizontal distance from clouds requirement for VFR flight is
2,000 feet. Answer number 4.
740. Except for a helicopter, the special VFR clearance authorizes the pilot of an aircraft to operate VFR while within a control zone.
Number 2, if clear of clouds and the visibility is at least 1 statute mile.
741. No person may operate an airplane within a control zone at night under special VFR unless
the airplane is equipped for instrument flight. Now think about this. It makes sense. If you remember control zones, the weather zone is to keep scud runners away from guys making instrument approaches. Hey, at night, like we just mentioned, you don't know when you're in the clouds. You don't know what the visibility is. So the whole point of this regulation is that you need to be instrument rated and instrument equipped. So if at night you take off in marginal weather and all of a sudden you find that you're in IFR or what we call IMC, instrument meteorological conditions, you're not afraid to get right on the gauges and fly the thing IFR, and then of course you need to get the appropriate IFR clearance. That's why this rule applies.
So it's not only the airplane is equipped for instrument flight, but also the
It has
pilot
to be IFR legal.
Is instrument rated and instrument current. 742. What are the minimum requirements for airplane operations under special VFR in a control zone at night?
Answer 4, the pilot must be instrument rated and the plane must be IFR equipped.
743. What is a minimum weather condition required for airplanes operating under special VFR in a control zone?
Well, you need 1 statute mile visibility. Answer number 1.
Let's go down to 745. Which VFR cruising altitude is acceptable for a flight on a Victor airway with a magnetic course of 175 degrees and the terrain is less than 1,000 feet?
Well, we remember that going east, it's odd thousands plus 500, and going west is even thousands plus 500. You just get your own memory jog on, just like when you were 3 years old and you learned the difference between left and right. You're going to have to learn odd thousands and even thousands, which is how we space traffic going in different directions. The answer is number 4, 5,500 feet.
Next page, question 746. Which VFR cruising altitude is acceptable for a flight on a Victor airway with a magnetic course of 185 degrees and the terrain is less than 1,000 feet?
Well, that would be even thousands, so the answer is number 2, 4,500 feet. Might be interesting to note, you might say, well, why 4,500 feet? Why not 4,000? Well, the IFR traffic, instrument traffic, all flies at even altitudes. So we kind of
even or odd, but I mean they're at the cardinal altitude.
At the cardinal altitude. So what's kind of interesting is we have 4 different levels of traffic flying around the country, 2 directions, going east and west. VFR traffic is divided by 1,000 feet by 500-foot increments, and all the IFR traffic is at the even or the cardinal altitudes, like Jeff said, so everything is 500 feet apart. That's why it's pretty important for you to maintain altitude pretty accurately when you're going cross country.
747. Each person operating an aircraft under VFR in level cruising flight at an altitude of more than 3,000 feet above the surface and below 18,000 feet MSL shall maintain an odd 1,000 plus 500-foot altitude while on a...
Number 2, a magnetic course. It's based on magnetic course of 0 degrees through 179. This ends most all the regulation questions dealing with operating procedures. The rest of them are going to deal now with maintenance and the inspections that are required, which means we only have 10 or 12 questions left.
But who's counting, right?
I'm counting them while you're reading.
748. The responsibility for ensuring that an aircraft is maintained in an airworthy condition is primarily that of the...
We've talked about this now. It's the owner or operator of the aircraft.
749.
Which is answer number 2.
Okay. 749. An airworthiness certificate remains valid.
Number 4, provided the aircraft is maintained and operated according to the FARs.
So it's valid forever as long as the airplane's maintained.
Exactly.
750. If an alteration or repair substantially affects an aircraft's operation in flight, that aircraft must be test flown by an appropriately rated pilot and approved for return to service prior to being operated.
Well, with passengers aboard, answer number 2.
751. Before passengers can be carried in an aircraft that has been altered in a manner that may have appreciably changed in its flight characteristics, it must be flight tested by an appropriately rated pilot with at least a...
Number 2, private pilot certificate. Let me just tell you what I do, and I've been in this situation a lot of times where I'm the first one to fly a rebuilt airplane that's been damaged or with a rebuilt engine or a major repair. I always take the mechanic along who did the work. Always.
Ensures and let him know while he's doing the work that he's going to have to do that.
He's the one who's coming up on that first ride.
752. Completion of an annual inspection and the return of the aircraft to service should always be indicated by...
Number 2, an appropriate notation in the aircraft maintenance records.
753. An aircraft's last annual inspection was performed on July 12th of this year. The next annual inspection will be due no later than...
Well, annual is annual. That's 12 months. Everything's calendar months except biannual flight reviews. Do we have an answer like that? Answer number 1, July 31st next year.
754. To determine the expiration date of the last annual aircraft inspection, a person should refer to the...
Maintenance records or the aircraft maintenance records. Answer number 3.
755. How long does the airworthiness certificate of an aircraft remain valid?
Well, Jeff just mentioned that it's good forever as long as you do the required maintenance, and the answer is number 3, as long as the aircraft is maintained and operated as required by FARs.
756. What aircraft inspections are required for a rental aircraft also used for flight instruction?
Well, it needs annual inspection. All aircraft need an annual inspection, and it needs 100-hour inspections. So answer number 1.
757. An aircraft had a 100-hour inspection when the tachometer read 1,259.6 or 1,259.6. When is the next 100-hour inspection due?
Well, the FAA is real literal about this, and when they say 100 hours, they mean 100 hours, not 100.1 or 101 or 110. It's 100 hours, so the answer is number 3, 1,359.6.
Next page, 758. A 100-hour inspection was due at 3302.5 hours on the tachometer. The 100-hour inspection was actually done at 3309.5. When is the next 100-hour inspection due?
Okay, well, this is kind of interesting. What happened is the people operating the aircraft went over by 7 hours. Well, the FAA doesn't give anything away for free in aviation. There's no giveaways, which means if you go over, that just comes off of your next inspection. I mean, you don't get to buy extra hours by extending it over. So the same thing, we just take 3302.5 at 100 hours, and the answer then would be 3402.5. We have an answer like that, answer number 2.
Was it legal for them to exceed by 7 hours, the 100-hour inspection?
Well, the way the rule reads is it's legal to exceed by 10 hours the 100-hour in order to take it to the place where the 100-hour is going to be done, but then those extra hours get taken off the subsequent 100-hour. The question didn't pose the exact wording to make this thing officially correct, but so 2 is the best way to answer this guy.
759. No person may use an ATC transponder unless it has been tested and inspected within the preceding
24 calendar months, answer number 4.
760. Which record or documents shall the owner or operator of an aircraft keep to show compliance with the applicable airworthiness directive, or AD?
An airworthiness directive is issued when an airplane has a significant problem that's been identified. We talked earlier about in-flight fires. Like, the NTSB always wants to know when there's a problem like that. When they identify a problem, they immediately get a notice out to every registered aircraft owner called an airworthiness directive that says either you fix it or your plane isn't going to be flown anymore. And there's a lot of this going on, especially in general aviation on older aircraft. So the answer is number 1, the aircraft maintenance records. That's where you look for everything.
By the way, an airworthiness directive may come out saying immediately. In other words, you don't take that airplane off again until whatever they're talking about, the required maintenance is performed, or it might say you have 100 hours in which to do this, so it isn't a shutdown until it's done, or it may be a time like done within the next 6 months or so. So airworthiness directives change from directive to directive. You just have to read the particular directive. And you as pilots don't normally see those ADs. Maintenance are the people that normally get them, though big cases that you hear about obviously get into the pilot scuttlebutt.
Yeah, let me make another point too, that you're not always privileged to every bit of information about the airplane you fly, especially with the rental aircraft, and 95% of you, I'm sure, are renting planes to learn to fly, and you're going to rent once you get your license. If an owner loses his maintenance records, the value of his airplane goes down substantially. He can never prove what's been done to the plane, when the engine's been rebuilt, so that generally they're very well guarded and kept in a place that you do not, as the pilot, have access to. They'll give them to you when you take your check rides, because you'll be asked to point things out. So it's in the maintenance records. You just don't always have access to them. That's the point.
Question 761. Which operation would be described as preventative maintenance?
Number 4, servicing landing gear wheel bearings.
762. Which operation would be described as preventative maintenance?
Number 3, refinishing decorative coating of fuselage. I didn't even find this in the regulations. I had to look this up in an advisory circular and read between a lot of paragraphs to get this answer, so don't be that concerned about this stuff.
And 763, the last FAR question. Preventative maintenance has been performed on an aircraft. What paperwork is required?
Number 4, the name of the person performing the work and a description of the work must be entered in the aircraft maintenance records. Hey, that's it for federal aviation regulations. We've covered a lot of questions here. We've covered 170 questions out of a possible 848 in the entire private pilot airplane test. So this module is very important. These questions are important and represent a minimum of 20% of your test. So if you memorize these and you learn them, you've got a lot of headway on this exam right now. This isn't the most interesting stuff, and it doesn't all apply to your flying, but get in there and memorize the cloud visibility and other requirements that are asked in the regulations so you do good here.